Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with part 34, The Conflict of the Origin of Freemasonry and Knights Templar by John Bennett. The Conflict. Mutual hatred had long existed between the Christians and the Mohammedans. The latter, aforetime, had done incalculable damage to the prospects of the cross. All that the missionaries and evangelicals had accomplished in Arabia, Abyssinia, Egypt, and northern Africa had been eradicated by the followers of the Prophet. The movement of the Mohammedans westward through Africa and northward into Europe in the 8th century was answered by the counter-movement of the Christians eastward through Europe and into Asia in the 11th. The sword of the living Godfrey was crossed with that of the dead Tariq. Previous of the opening of the conflict, however, and indirectly leading to it, Palestine had become the Mecca of pious pilgrims who, from all parts of Christendom, threaded their weary way to the land made sacred by their Lord and Master, that they might do penance for their sins or quickening their zeal by visiting hallowed scenes. A great stimulus was given to the undertaking by the mother of Constantine, Helena, who visited the Holy Land in AD 325, and in pious zeal used the immense wealth at her command in building altars, chapels, and houses of prayer in places made historical by events in the Savior's life. She erected the famous Church of the Nativity at Bethlehem, the city of his birth, built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem on the supposed site of his tomb, and laid the foundations of the Church of the Resurrection. Her industrious example naturally awakened new zeal for pilgrimage. Henceforth, thousands upon thousands, princes and peasants, noble and beggars, the devout and the mercenary, annually thronged the thoroughfares on their way to the city of the great king. But while this was going on, Jerusalem, then under the control of the Roman Empire, was taken possession of in 637 by the soldiers of Islam, commanded by the famous Mohammedan chieftain, Omar. He erected the mosque bearing his name on the site of the Temple of Solomon and restored the enclosures of the temple, a tribute paid to King Solomon, whose faith, like Mohammedans, recognized but one, living and true God. Owing to Omar's tolerance, for a long period the Christians were undisturbed in their pilgrimages and devotions. But in 1073, Palestine was overrun and conquered by hordes of Seljuk Turks, who came out of the northeast through Khorasan and other provinces of Persia. They were more in the form of revolutionists than conquerors, as they were already the disciples of Islam. The Arabian Fatimid governors were obliged to retire into Egypt. The holy city fell under the dominion of Sultan Malik Shah and his viceroys, who instituted a high revel of violence and outrage against both Christians and Arabs, infested by bands of lawless men. The roads of Jerusalem became no longer safe for pilgrims. They were robbed of their much or little wealth. Men were thrown into slavery. Women were outraged. Children were stolen or murdered, and although doubtless there were enthusiasts who courted these perils in the holy cause, yet the vast majority of Christendom were filled with grief and vengeance as returning pilgrims told the ghastly tale of pagan atrocities. In this state of affairs, when there was scarcely a circle that was not saddened or bereaved by the brutal treatment of the pilgrims, Peter the Hermit, a monk and native of Amiens in France, having visited Palestine and witnessed the cruelty of the Turks, reported what he had seen to Pope Urban II, by whom encouraged he traveled through Italy and France and began to preach the First Crusade. Peter had been educated in France and in Italy, had served in the army of Flanders, but gave up the military career and married, became a monk after the death of his wife, and finally a hermit. possessed of no other power than the influence of his character and his genius. This simple unshod monk, a man of mean aspect, clad in coarse cassock, around which a rude rope served as a girdle, mounted on a mule, and holding a gleaming crucifix in his hand, rode from town to town and from province to province, rehearsing the indignities heaped upon the innocent pilgrims. In graphic language, he depicted the scenes of blood of which he had been an eyewitness in the streets of Jerusalem, appealing in turn to the piety, the courage, and the passions of his hearers. By his eloquence, he fired the popular heart to go forth and redress the wrongs and rescue a desecrated tomb from the hands of the infidel. As a consequence of his impassioned harangues, such a wave of enthusiasm for his enterprise surged throughout Christendom that the reigning powers felt its mighty swell, and in the year 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II espoused his cause and gave pontifical sanction to the First Crusade. Previous to the setting out of the true crusade, 4 armies, if they may be so named, consisting of the disorderly multitudes of the dregs of Christendom, had departed for Palestine. Preaching the Crusade. The eastern frontiers of France became the scene of the gathering. There, Peter the Hermit, as the chief promoter of the enterprise, assumed the leadership of the host. Without adequate preparation, without suitable arms, without any appreciation of the dangers and difficulties to be encountered, the vast and tumultuous throng swept out of France and into Germany. The great sea of anger and excited humanity overflowed the ordinary routes of travel and spread devastation on every hand. The means of subsistence were quickly exhausted, and the multitude began to prey on the countries through which they traversed. They swept on through the German territories like an army of devouring locusts, until through a sheer waste of resources, they were obliged to divide into smaller masses. One band, numbering about 20,000, commanded by Walter the Penniless, a French knight of Burgundy, pressed forward through Hungary and Bulgaria in the direction of Constantinople. The Bulgarians took up arms to defend their country from destruction. The track of Walter and his army was marked with blood and fire. The Crusaders were cut off day by day until at the confines of the country, only Walter and a few followers remained to make their way through the forest to Constantinople. Meanwhile, the 2nd Division of the host, numbering about 40,000 men, women, and children, under the command of Peter the Hermit, pressed on in the same direction taken by Walter. They, too, were pursued and furiously attacked by the wild Bulgarians, who caused a general rout and slaughter of thousands of their number. The remaining wretched, half-starved fugitives in time arrived at Constantinople, where, under the protection of Emperor Alexius, who had espoused the crusade, the two united their forces, crossed the Bosporus into Asia Minor, and encountered the Turks at Nice. There they were utterly routed and slaughtered. Walter the Penniless was killed, and the remaining remnant returned to Constantinople. A third rabble soon followed from Germany. A certain monk named Gottschall, envious of the fame of Peter and Walter, preached the holy war through his native districts, and about 15,000 villagers and peasants flocked to his standard. They followed the same route as the others, and before the walls of Belgrade, they were massacred by the Hungarians, almost to a man. In the meantime, the 4th and last division of the host gathered on the eastern confines of Germany. Perhaps no other such a detestable mass of vile humanity was ever seen before or since in the world. France sent her thieves. The Rhine provinces, their offscouring, the British Islands, their outlaws, and all the West, her pads and murderers. This delightful army of European refuse heaped up to the number of more than 200,000. A few ignorant nobles with their bands of retainers were merged in the common mass. But when it came to the election of leaders, the choice fell on a goat and a goose. These ridiculous creatures were actually set forth as the divinely constituted agents by which the host was to be led to victory over the infidel Turks of Asia. The result was as revolting as the beginning was abominable. The superstitious herd fell upon the Jewish colonists in the cities of the Rhine and the Moselle and began to rob and murder. The rabble pretended to see in the Jews only the enemies of Christ. In spite of the protest of the Romish Church, under whose call the crusade had begun, the Jews were massacred by thousands when the ruffian host could find no material to slaughter. The march was resumed from the Rhine to the Danube. The whole route was a scene of barbarous lust and licentiousness. The day of judgment, however, at last arrived. At the Danube, the Hungarian army was drawn up to dispute the progress of the invaders. The immense rabble was hemmed in and beaten back against the river. The tide of the Danube was red with the blood of the robbers. Very few escaped the vengeance of the Hungarians in the engulfing river. Thus perished the fourth and last of these fanatic multitudes that arose at the call of Peter the Hermit. Already more than 250,000 human beings had been swallowed up from sight before a regular army could be equipped and started in the wake of the popular tumult. Not a Christian soldier had thus far penetrated beyond the plan of Nice. Walter the Penniless was dead. The fame of Peter the Hermit was also at a discount, but the fever of Europe was nowise cooled. It remained for her soldiery to undertake by regular expedition what her peasants and monks, her goose and her goat, had failed to accomplish. In the meantime, the secular princes of the West, who attended the Council of Clermont and assumed the cross, were busily engaged in preparing for the Holy War, a vast army embracing all the chivalry of Europe, consisting of 6 grand divisions, set forth for Constantinople. Here they united their forces and then undertook up their march for the Holy City. Among those who were destined to distinguish themselves as crusaders should be mentioned, first of all, Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lorraine. His reputation for piety, learning, and courage was equal to that of the best prince of his age. In his father's house, Peter the Hermit had lived before he became a monk. In early life, Godfrey took up arms and won high distinction as a soldier in many bloody fought battles. With no half-hearted purpose did he become a crusader. No sacrifices were spared to secure the desired end. He sold or mortgaged all of his castles and estates, and with the money procured by the sale of his vast domains, he raised and equipped a magnificent army of 90,000 men. It was he who led those from Germany and northern France. Raymond, Count of Toulouse, a second of the leaders, was a soldier by profession and had fought against the Mohammedans in Spain. He was known as one of the most valiant captains of his times. It was his saying that he had spent his youth fighting the followers of the false prophet in Europe and would spend his old age in warring with them in Asia. Already aged, with white locks, made him a conspicuous leader for those of southern France. Prince Bowman of Taranto, Italy, who led the Italian forces, was the tallest man in his army. He was full of passion and haughty pride. When he spoke, his hearers believed that eloquence had been his only study. When under arms, he might be supposed to have done nothing but wield the lance and sword. The deliverance of the tomb of Christ was not the subject that induced him to assume the cross. He helped to win a kingdom before he should arrive at Jerusalem. After the fall of Antioch, his vain hopes were realized by his becoming the first prince of Antioch. Hugh the Great, Count of Vermandois, led the French forces. He was brother of King Philip of France. At home he was much admired for his brilliant qualities by the court. He was brave, but easily overcome by flattery, and was wanting in perseverance in reverses. Robert, Duke of Normandy, who led the Norman forces, was the son of William the Conqueror. He had a few noble qualities, but many reprehensible faults. His extravagance, weakness, and inconsistency caused him to be unpopular and, in the end, reduced him to absolute poverty. Robert, Count of Flanders, was at the head of the Frisons and the Flemings, or Dutch forces. He embarked in an expedition which procured for him the reputation of a bold knight, together with the surname of the Lance and Sword of the Christians. All these leaders were celebrated for their exploits, but no one amongst that vast army was more worthy to attract the attention of posterity than the brave Tancred from the island of Sicily, whose piety and friendship for his cousin, Prince Bohemond, under whom he served, led him into Asia. A stranger to all the motives and interests of policy, he acknowledged no other law but religion and honor, and was ready to die in their cause. He was made Prince of Tiberias and finally died at Antioch in 1112. The First Crusade. The forces thus gathered out of the prolific West numbered fully 600,000 warriors. Of these, 100,000 were mounted knights, and the remainder foot soldiers in armor. The mixed character of the throng was still preserved. Priest, matron, and maid journeyed by the side of the warriors. At the head rode the austere Godfrey, the white-haired Raymond, and Peter the Hermit seated on a mule. This immense army pressed steadily forward, and after capturing Nice, Antioch, and other cities on the way, this army, though greatly reduced in numbers by privations and conflict, at length came upon the object of its ambition, Jerusalem, in the year 1099. The city was taken on the 15th of July, after an obstinate siege of somewhat more than 5 weeks. Assault after assault was made upon the unyielding walls, only to be repulsed, and the jaded remnant of only 40,000 of what was once a vast army were on the point of abandoning the undertaking, when Godfrey, looking up to the Mount of Olives, beheld there a mighty horseman waving on high a buckler. "Behold," cried the hero, "St. George comes again to our aid and makes a signal for us to enter the holy city." The effect was magical. The army, seized as if by an electric enthusiasm, made an irresistible charge, carried the walls, and Jerusalem was taken. History has remarked that the Christians entered Jerusalem on a Friday at the hour of 3 in the afternoon, exactly the same day and hour at which Christ expired for the salvation of the human race. Among those who received the greatest congratulations by the victorious multitude was Peter the Hermit. The little fanatic monk was singled out as the greatest of all the human agencies by which the deliverance of Jerusalem had been accomplished. Around him, clad in his woolen garment and mounted on his mule, the medieval zealots gathered in enormous crowds, and did obeisance as to a liberator and savior. Godfrey of Bouillon soon came in for his share of glory. Within 8 days of the fall of the city, he was on the 23rd of July elected King of Jerusalem. Godfrey accepted the office, but refused the title of king. He declared that it would be unbecoming in him to wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had been crowned with thorns. It was therefore decided that he be entitled First Baron and Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Jerusalem. His sovereignty, however, was ample and his right undisputed. Soon after many of the princes and leaders returned to Europe, Peter the Hermit likewise left the holy city and started on a homeward voyage. In mid-sea his ship was caught in a storm, and the terrified monk vowed if he should be spared, he would found an abbey in honor of the tomb of Christ. The tempest passed, and Peter kept his vow by building a monastery on the banks of the Maze in France. Here he spent the remnant of his days in penitential works, after the manner of his order. About a year after the taking of Jerusalem, as Godfrey was returning from an expedition, the Emir of Caesarea came out to meet him and presented to him an offering of some of the fruits of Palestine. The unsuspecting Godfrey accepted and ate an apple. Doubtless it had been poisoned, for the prince almost immediately fell ill. It was with great difficulty that he reached Jaffa, whence he was conveyed to his capital, where on the 18th of July, 1100, he died. His mortal remains were deposited within the enclosure of Calvary, near the tomb of Christ. He surpassed all the captains of his age, and his name will live honored amongst men as long as the remembrance of the Crusades. Godfrey was succeeded by his brother, Baldwin of Edessa, as Baldwin I, and upon his death in 1118, was succeeded by Baldwin de Bourg, a cousin of Baldwin I, under the title of Baldwin II. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.